Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Without further ado, let's begin on our first session for today, the panel discussion on Chinese political economy, trends and transformations. May we invite Dr. Adam on stage for the opening remarks. Thank you.
Is the mic on? Is on, right? Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you all very much for coming to this very exciting session on Chinese political economy, trends and transformations. If we were to have this session on Chinese economy a few years ago, we'd be talking about, what's China's growth prospects, what are the sources of growth in the future. But today, as we all know, Chinese economy is facing quite some troubles. And so today, I have some of the best scholars and best minds on the study of Chinese economy with us today to enlighten us on China's growth prospects and what are the sort of the institutional challenges for continued economic growth in the future. So first of all, we have Zoe Liu from Council on Foreign Relations. She is the Morris R. Greenberg Senior Fellow for China Studies. She's one of the media sort of celebrities nowadays. Last year, if you follow discussions on the Chinese economy, she had a very influential discussion about China's so-called long economic COVID with the president of the Peterson Institute of International Economics, Adam Posner. She's all over YouTube, so feel free to check her work out. Also, she has a very influential book on sovereign funds, how the Communist Party of China finances its global ambitions. She's going to be the first speaker today, and next, we have Professor Huan Huan with us. She is a scholar of finance and public policy. Her work interests lies at the intersection of international finance, public finance, household finance, so on and so forth. She has not only published at top-notch finance and economics journals, but has also published with prestigious journals such as Nature. So I very much envy her as a colleague. And next we have Professor Li Chen from CUHK. He is the Associate Professor and Associate Director at the Center for China Studies at CUHK, but also a Research Fellow at CUHK's Lau Chor Tok Institute of Global Economics and Finance, also Associate Professor by courtesy at CUHK's School of Finance and Policy Science. And he's also a non-resident fellow at the Institute for International Affairs, CUHK, Shenzhen. And he's one of the most sought-after commentators on the Chinese economy nowadays, particularly on the growth prospects of the Greater Bay Area in China. And last and hardly the least, we also have our own colleague at the school, Professor Xi Lu, whose research interests lie in applied econometrics, political economy, economic development. He teaches one of the most popular classes at the school on corruption and economic development. Again, he's also one of the most sought-after commentators on the Chinese economy in Singapore. And I would say he's also one of the most intelligent and incisive observers of the Chinese political economy in general, but also cross-strait relations as well. So we are very fortunate to have some of the best minds with us. Without further ado, I think we're going to have Professor Zoe Liu first with us. She's going to be talking about 4 Ds in the Chinese economy: debt, demand, demographics, and de-risking or decoupling. Zoe. Thank you very much.
It's truly a great honor and pleasure to be here. This is my first time at the Lee Kuan Yew School, and special thanks to my good friend Adam, who I highly respect, but also when people ask me, hey Zoe, a lot of things are going on in the Chinese banking sector. Who should I read, or who should I be talking to? I'm like, well, you ask the right person, not because I know anything about it, but because I know the best mind on the Chinese banking sector. And also, I really appreciate the opportunity for everyone here. Thank you for your time. So for my presentation today, I really wanted to focus on a framework to understand the Chinese economy, because exactly as Adam pointed out, if we were focusing on or having this conversation, say up until 2000, perhaps 2009 or 2010, if you ask me, hey Zoe, how do you think about the Chinese economy? I would be like, well, the Chinese economy is more or less like a impressionist painting, like a Monet. It looks beautiful from afar, but there are some, problems if you look close enough. And since we are talking about it today, and I do think that we can think about the Chinese economy using abstract painting, in particular, folks like Jackson Pollock. The idea is it looks like a jumbled mess from afar, and it looks a bit messy up close. So for me, I wanted to focus on these 4 Ds. The reason I wrote about it in October 2022. At that time, many people were still thinking that the Chinese economy is going to have a rapid recovery, especially because of the COVID, right immediately after the COVID lockdown. But specifically because of what I talked about in terms of the 4 Ds, I do think there are longer-term structural challenges inside the Chinese economy, as well as from the global market. So from this point of view, what I wanted to So the 4 Ds, as Adam pointed out, it started with debt and then goes into demand. And the demand I will talk about both export, but more specifically and more importantly, constraining in the longer term would be domestic consumption, in particular domestic household consumption. And then demographics, and last but not least, decoupling or de-risking. And perhaps the ramification or the outcome of these 4 Ds, if you wanted to add a 5th one, could potentially be deflation, or more specifically, deflationary pressure. Not necessarily to say that the Chinese economy is in deflation or in deflation per se. Part of the reason is because, well, the CPI has a lot of calculation, in particular overweight of pork prices, but there you go. Then finally, I think very much relevant for the policy focus here in Lee Kuan Yew School, thinks that for policy-oriented studies, or for that matter, Chinese policymakers, I think many people have been asking this question: to what extent the Chinese economy or Chinese policymakers can learn from Japan's not just lost 1 decade, but lost 2 decades. People have been talking about that. But I think there is another, perhaps, potential risk, which is to what extent the Chinese policymakers are facing the challenges of the Soviet Union. Now, let me begin with debt. And the story of debt, the charts here are mostly for eye candy purposes. And the idea is to show that, well, yes, indeed, the Chinese, in terms of macro leverage ratio, is now above 280% in terms of debt to GDP. But if you only look at debt, that is not necessarily the only problem, because Finance 101, you leverage the hell out of your balance sheet, and that is how you can potentially magnify your return, right? But the problem with that is once your debt growth, and in particular the cost of servicing your debt, becomes more expensive, and the growth of your debt becomes faster than your GDP growth, it becomes more problematic in terms of to what extent you can sustain this kind of debt-financed growth. And in fact, this is one of the highly leveraged growth is part of the reason challenged the Japanese economy, right? So that's that. Then on the demand side, I wanted to, people talk a lot about China's economic growth model as an export-oriented economy. And as you can see, showing from these 2 charts, export contribution to the Chinese economy has not just plateaued, but still have not recovered to pre-COVID level yet. Although people talk about, well, China's the so-called 3 new categories, or 新三样, EVs, batteries, and solar cells. But given the rise of protectionism, not just from countries like the United States or European Union, but also broadly speaking, many developing countries, it seems that the growth of export contribution to GDP growth seems to be plateaued, if not going to continue to shrink. And I'm not going to focus too much on external demand or, for that matter, international market. What I want you to focus on is really household consumption. Here, a very quick footnote about statistics. Yes, if you read Chinese news sources, you would say very frequently people talk about domestic demand to contribute to at least 60 or even 80% of the Chinese GDP. But that is really aggregated demand, not just household consumption. If you only look at household consumption contribute to the GDP growth in China, it actually stayed more or less around 38%, or for that matter, for a long period of time, below 40%. Now, providing some global context, the average, at a global level, the average contribution of household consumption to GDP is about 60%. So from that point of view, the Chinese economy is chronically under-consumed. And there are reasons to believe that perhaps it is going to be very challenging for the Chinese economy to change towards a domestic consumption-driven model, and I'm happy to talk more about that during Q&A. But that's household consumption. Then the next one, in terms of demographics. This is not new. This is not old story. You all understand that the Chinese economy, or in terms of demographic trend, has suffered from 2 years of negative growth. Now people talk about the loss of labor premium in particular, and for that matter, the rising cost of taking care of older people. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about a near to midterm shock of the demographics, which is on the housing market. The subcontext of shrinking population is both a product of a lower birth rate, but also a slower growth of family formation ratio. Meaning younger people are not necessarily getting married as fast as they were before, which basically means demand for housing is going to continue shrink. And knowing that housing, or for that matter, property market contribute to about 30% of the Chinese GDP, you know this is going to be a challenge in the near to medium term. Now, decoupling or de-risking. This is more structural challenges from the global market, not just because of global multinationals are trying to shift overseas because of the rise of production costs in China. Part of the reason could be driven by the Chinese, the loss of labor market premium, but also because of a COVID shock, but also because of a lot of policy missteps in the Chinese economy. So from that point of view, decoupling or de-risking is not necessarily going to change in the near term. So from that point of view, I do think that these 4 Ds are going to shift. Oh, let me go back. Can I go back? Yes. The 4 Ds are going to continue change, not just the Chinese economy, but also the global geopolitics. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more during Q&A, but I want to go back to this slide, which is what is the direction of the Chinese economy? Part of the reason, or the story that we are very much familiar with, is to what extent the Chinese economy is going to become Japanese-nized, not just because of the burst of the property market bubble, but also because of rising trade protectionism from the West, to what extent China can handle trade tensions with the West, just the same as Japan has done. But realizing that China was established, when China was established back in 1949, the country was established under extreme international isolation. And now the idea of, or if you view Western policies from Beijing, it seems that the West is very much determined to contain China, although the United States try to say that, well, that's not really what we are trying to do. So from that point of view, to what extent China can learn the lesson from the Soviet Union is very much a valid policy question to study as well. So I just stop there, and I'll turn the floor to Huang. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joy, for paving the way for my talk here. So I'm going to carry over to talk about how the fiscal policy, which is a reason why the debt grows so much in the past few years, is shaping the growth pattern in China, and whether it's worthy to continue growing the debt to pursue the expansionary fiscal policy? And if it is, where should the government put the money on, and where should they get the money? So Joey has been talking about the growing debt, and here, if you see, the growing debt is accompanied by growing government spending in the past few years, and this is supported by growing fiscal deficit, and the fiscal deficit is supported by increasing government borrowing. And if you look at this chart, the pattern is growing particularly strong after the 2015, and especially if you look at the trend, it accelerates. It's becoming steeper after the global financial crisis. And if you recall, China has pursued several rounds of expansionary fiscal policy in the past few years. But how come all of a sudden in recent years it sort of stopped pursuing such aggressive fiscal policy? So when I look at this variation across the regions, China's central government is doing a lot of they spend a lot on economies, and is trying hard to push their construction of various infrastructure projects. But the local governments are the major drivers of these mega projects at the local provinces. And if you look at the variation across provinces, one interesting pattern has emerged. If you look at those, they are darker, which means that they spend more relative to their GDP. It tends to focus on the industry who is relatively less developed, whose GDP growth tends to be weaker. But if you look at the coastal areas whose GDP growth is relatively faster, these regional economies, their public spending is actually relatively modest. And if you look at their debt burden, it shows similar patterns. So they're the ones spend quite modestly, and they are also the one that borrows modestly. And why and how this meddling for their fiscal policy expansion? Before I go to that, I'd like to review a little bit of costs and benefits that are prevailing in the literature on fiscal policy. So we know the benefits very clear. So many people ascribe also many scholars ascribe the recent fast growth in the US economy to the fiscal stimulus package rolled out immediately after the COVID. So US is the one that rolled out the unprecedented fiscal stimulus that saved the vulnerables, including distributing the cash directly to the households. And look at the GDP growth for the US in the past few years. They are one of the best performers in the world economy. So they are the one that recovers the most after the COVID. And if you also look at the past few examples of fiscal policy conducted by China, so China doesn't hurt much. China wasn't hurt much during the 2007 and 2008 global financial crisis. And China was, stimulating the economy quite aggressively by rolling out unprecedented fiscal policy at the time, although there's a debates on whether this money is going to the right places, which will come back later. So many argue that it goes to the real estate market, which distort the capital allocation efficiency. But overall, if you see the past few economic growth generally is doing okay. And if you look at the money that's spent on infrastructure, so whoever that has traveled around China in recent years, you will be amazed by how convenient it is to travel from one city to another, and how efficient and comfortable it is to ride this high-speed railway. And this not only reduce the carbon emissions, but also improve the social welfare of these people, especially those located or live in the relatively remote areas. But of course, there are costs. For example, if the money they are spent by government is allocated to a sector that is not productive, it means there's a capital allocation inefficiency. That's the distortion which hurt the overall economic growth. And if you look at some other causes, it means that you have to borrow to finance these government spending. And this is particularly a problem if you're already heavily in debt. Think about you are borrowing 10% to finance a growth of 5%. That's a cost for you, right? Similarly for the governments. So the costs and benefits, one has to evaluate very carefully whether this is worthwhile to continue to borrow. And if your debt burden is so heavy, you will have to pay significantly more to borrow from the market. And whether this is going to be worthwhile, then we have to think about it. To answer these questions, we would employ this fiscal multiplier concept, which measures the output growth in response to the expanding growth. So we are doing this study to show how can the governments utilize limited resources to promote the economic growth. So where would the money generate the highest impact on the growth? So if we explore this, basically we are saying that the money goes to wherever or whichever governments that can turn these limited sources into powerful economic growth. So if you look at across country, across regional variations, provinces like Shandong and the other coastal areas definitely have better impacts in turning the limited resources into relatively large economic growth. And if you also look at the sectors, surprisingly, property market is one of the sectors that could turn the government spending into high economic growth. This surprised us because property market is the one that are getting China into this trouble. But how come they are generating such a high impact on economic growth? So if you see how interconnected they are in China's economy and how much they have engaged the household, especially household consumption that we have just talked about. Look at those people who own a housing and whose wealth increased so much in the past few years. They are benefiting from the booming property market in China, are driving the household consumption in a lot of places. And now with the opposite happening, the shrinkage in the wealth of this housing is reducing or discourage this household consumption significantly. So that's why you see that despite a various stimulus package, these people, driven by declined wealth, is trying to cut their spending. And this is dragging down a lot of other sectors' growth as well. So whether this is a time to bail out the property market, we don't have a say yet. But if you look at this data, if the government can bail out the real estate market in 2009, why can't they do so, given its deeper connection with the other sector, given its high impact on economic growth in the current situation? So we're basically saying, if you want to increase the efficiency of the fiscal policy, if you want to make the government spending impactful, then put the money in the property sector might be one of the wise choice. Other than that, we have to think about where to raise the money. A traditional way is use the fiscal revenues, right? So if you are using the fiscal revenue, basically they will generate a higher fiscal multipliers. Having said that, we're basically comparing this with the government spending. They are financed by debt. So overall, if you are financing the public spending with the fiscal revenues, then it would have a more positive impact on the economic growth. So using your own money is like corporate. If you're using your own money to finance the growth, it tends to be growing faster because your cost is lower. Whereas if you're using the debt to finance this growth, you have to pay something for that, right? You have to make sure that your growth is higher than the cost of financing. So again, we are pointing to the direction of raising the funding, and you see the property tax also contributes significantly. Let me just stop here and pass the stage to Li-Chen, please.
Thank you, everyone. So it's my great honor to be here. So I was a visiting research fellow at the NUS 7 years ago, so it's wonderful to come back and to have this opportunity to share with you my observation on Chinese political economy. Right, the theme of today's panel is about the trends and transformation of Chinese political economy. I think we all have a keen sense that a lot has changed in terms of China's role in the world and also the internal dynamics of Chinese politics and economic development. And one thing that's very clear is that we cannot understand what's going on in China and the policy choices in China without making reference to what's going on in the structure of a global political economy. I think we have seen a paradigm shift in terms of the regime of global trade and investment and economic governance, right? So whatever terms you use, deglobalization, slow ballization, and whatever terms you use. I think there's one term that I quite like that is put forward by a report by IMF. That is, we're entering into an era of geo-economic fragmentation, right? So we've seen this in the rise of trade protectionism, right? The increasingly more restrictive environment for cross-border trade, as well as the restrictions on technology transfer. It is within this context that we have seen some fundamental shift in terms of China's domestic economic governance strategies. First of all, I think there's a stronger emphasis on security, right? So in Chinese own words, so it's about China needs to better coordinate security and development, right? So that is a thing applies not only to China, but also all the other major powers, right? Major economies in the world. So it is within this framework that we have seen a lot of regulatory changes in the Chinese economy, right? So we see the tightening of real estate sector, right? The rectification of the financial sector, right? And a whole series of governance structure reforms in order to strengthen China's capability in safeguarding its own security. And China has now emphasized a holistic view of security in the sense that it's not just about political security, military security, but equally important, economic and financial security. And this has a whole set of implications, right, for better or worse, right? So on the one hand, it clearly helps China to adapt to a more fragmented, more volatile global environment. But on the other hand, it runs a risk of making the policies overly securitized, right? So I think that is the first point in understanding a lot of changes in China's domestic political economy in terms of the rising importance of security. And the second important trend or theme of change is to understand the changing pattern of central-local relations, right? So when you analyze the dynamics of China's economic reform and development over the past 3 or 4 decades, right? So it has often been said that the combination of top-down strategic guidance and bottom-up, the local government-led experimentalism and reform dynamism has been at the center of China's success, right? So I think rightly so, but this pattern has been changing, right? So in the old days, we emphasize on the incentives that the fiscal system in China has provided for local governments, right, to promote economic growth, to maximize local budgetary revenue or extra budgetary income, and the incentive for local government to develop real estate sector, increase land finance, etc. Right? But that environment is changing, right? So as the real estate and the urban development enters into a new phase, and also in terms of bureaucratic promotion. The game of bureaucratic promotion, right? There's a kind of tournament competition that we see among local government officials, and that incentive structure is also changing, right? So we are entering into a new phase of China's reform and development in which we have a much more complex tapestry of incentives and interactions within the Chinese state, right? So if you unpack the Chinese state, right, in terms of what the roles are of the central government and what the roles are at the provincial level, the municipality level, and the county level, and things are changing. So, but now I want to highlight that over the past five years or so, right, so we have seen a very important direction, that is to emphasize the role of region as a new agent of change in China's reform and development, right? So in the previous few decades, when we analyze who are the agents of change, right? Who are the agents of promoting institutional reform, right? And guide the resource allocation to promote actual economic development, we emphasize local governments or private sector, right? So in terms of local governments, we emphasize county, municipality, province, which roughly mirror the administrative structure of the Chinese state. But now we are seeing interesting initiatives that try to go beyond the framework of the existing administrative structure, right? A key example of this is the initiative to promote the development of Guangdong, Hong Kong, Macau, Greater Bay Area. And this area has always been important, right? Geographically, it has always been important. It has been at the forefront of China's reform and opening up, right? So now it has 86 million people, right? So which accounts for 6% of China's population, right? So it has about 56,000 square kilometers, only 0.6% of China's total land area. But it produces over 11% of the Chinese GDP, right? So 1.9 trillion US dollars last year. So it has always been important economically, right? So as an economic region. But most profoundly over the last 5 years is that we are seeing the rise of this region as a political and institutional construct in the sense that it is becoming an agent of reform, an agent of change. Right? So this area encompasses Hong Kong, Macau, and also 9 important mainland cities in Guangdong. So, and very interestingly, it operates under one country and two system, right? So it has 3 currencies, 3 regulatory systems, 3 different governance frameworks, and it really lies at the interface between what we call the Chinese domestic economic circulation and also the international economic circulation. So it's very important, right? So in China's the new phase of reform and opening up, and we are seeing very interesting institutional experiments try to enhance the connectivity among these cities, right? So Guangdong, the mainland cities in Guangdong and Hong Kong and Macau, without compromising the institutional diversity in the region. So as you can imagine, how the business environment functions in Hong Kong is very different from how the business environment functions in Shenzhen. So we are seeing a whole series of reforms that not only tries to enhance connectivity to promote more effective flows of capital, talent, and technologies and data, while taking cautious steps not to compromise the institutional diversity in the region. So, and then when it comes to the new strategy of navigating, right, this complex external environment, China's policymakers has come up with this idea of dual circulation, right? So again, this is a term of strong Chinese characteristics, but basically it conveys how the Chinese policymakers think about this world, right? I think why we distinguish, why in China we make distinctions between the domestic and the international circulation. I think a key factor is to what extent, right, the security can be maintained, to what extent the allocation of resources, right, can be stabilized, right? So for Chinese policymakers, the domestic economic circulation, well, it is within, more or less, within the control of the domestic policy making, and we are seeing increasing emphasis on how to increase domestic demand, as Zoe emphasized, consumption, right, and also domestic investment, while also navigating all sorts of challenges posed by debt. And then on the supply side, China has been working very hard, trying to promote indigenous technological innovation, right, reduce its reliance on external supply chains, and trying to working very hard to achieve breakthrough, right? So in some critical technological segments, and we have already seen that in some of the recent achievement of Huawei. And again, Huawei is a Greater Bay Area based company. So to summarize, I think Chinese economy faced a lot of challenges, and some of this results from the external environment. Some of these challenges results from the past practices, the past model of growth, and now we are entering into a phase of navigating these challenges, and which inevitably is painful, but we're seeing very exciting new dynamics as well, and especially in the context of the Greater Bay Area. With that comment, I will conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Actually, I'm not going to talk any specific issue like the previous speakers. I'm not going to talk the 3Ds. I'm not going to talk about fiscal policy or security. But I just want to raise a more fundamental question, at least to myself. All the things that happen to China today, everyone sitting here, do you believe that is an economic issue or is that a political issue? If we want to solve the problem, should we look into the economic side or should we into the political side? When we talk about politics, is that international politics really matter or domestic politics really matter? When we talk about security, whose security we are talking about? So as a last speaker here, I just want to give a more comprehensive, not so specific details, but instead a very comprehensive picture which reflects my understanding of the past, today, and the future of China. Okay. So first, as an echo to Prof. Li Chen, I totally agree with him, saying that the old Chinese model has already ended. So if we recall the economic development history of China starting from the early of 1980s to 10 years ago, to 2012, the driving force of the fast economic miracle actually is what? It's competition. And it contains two different phases of competition. The first phase is of logic, that is between the 1980 to the middle of the 1994, which was driven by fiscal federalism, fiscal decentralization, fiscal incentive. And the second phase of logic of competition, starting from the middle of the 1990s, which was driven by the political incentive. Somebody used a theory called a promotion tournament to summarize that. But since 10 years ago, the whole institutional structure has already changed. Today's China, I have to say, the institutional foundation of local competition has been heavily weakened. For example, if you look at the policy targets that the central government assigned to the local government and ask them to finish, you will find that these policy targets tend to be more short-term instead of long-term. And many of the targets start to not so align with the local government's own interests. So previous years, we say that no matter the center or local, both of them want to promote local economy. So even those local officials could not get promoted in the end. Of course, they still had the incentive to be participating into those kind of promotion game. But now you could say that what kind of new policies has replaced the old ones? The new policies that we have right now is poverty alleviation, environmental protection. The local governors actually, they do not want to get into these kind of things because they have to move more resources to this kind of new tax, but the resources they used could benefit themselves. So the second is that these kind of short-term policies requires more specialized policy support from the upper level government. If you want to do a policy about poverty alleviation, of course, you need to rely the support from the even upper level of the governments. Due to these kind of changes, actually local jurisdictions, they cannot be comparable with each other. So how could you say that my performance in my own jurisdictions could be compared with the other jurisdictions' performance? You are doing different things. You are receiving different policy support. So which means that competition between local jurisdictions cannot last anymore. So if there's no institutional foundation for the local competition, then the China model that we have been familiar with has already ended. Then what will be the next China model if there's any hope that in the future? If you read the 20th Central Committee's third plenary session, that report released in July, actually we can clearly feel that one of the potential future of China model is to build the largest industrial policy initiative in the history. So we're all familiar with the development history of Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, that since the 1950s and 1970s. So in academic world, we have a terminology called the developmental state, which means that the government, the central government, initiated a lot of industrial policies and guided the funds into the industries they want to develop. So we could say that China would like to repeat this path, but will lift the level to be much higher than Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. You could say that, for example, today's China, they have already focused on several manufacture fields. For example, the new energy, the EV, high level of advanced manufacturing, Industry 4.0, these kind of things. And also, if you read the third plenary sessions report, you can find that China is preparing to build a very comprehensive talent development plan to support its national level industrial policy. But the problem, or we say the concern of this ambitious plan include the following points. First is that whether the industrial policy will turn to be effective and efficient. So there has been a lot of debates. And also you could say that in Japan and South Korea, especially Japan, the industrial policy worked quite well in 1950s to 1970s, but starting from the 1980s, actually when you made any kind of judge errors about the future of any specific industry, you will say that the government leading industrial policy, this kind of development mode, can also fail. And one of the biggest concern, other than whether the industrial policy will be effective or efficient, beyond that, another very important concern is the bureaucratic structure of China. So for Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, they had the successful industrial policy. One of the most important reasons is that all of them had an independent bureaucratic structure. So you could say that they are 事务官, they are bureaucratic officials. They can make their own decisions. They have voting system, and the politicians voted by the electrical system, by the election system. Actually, they can hardly affect the decision of its own. We say that the technical experts in the bureaucratic system. But in China, starting from 5 years ago, or 7 years ago, starting from the 19th Party Congress, we could say that the role of the State Council has been weakened. Now the ministers of the State Council, they turn to be the secretaries of the small working group of the party itself. So no important role of the State Council anymore. If your technical experts as the bureaucrats, if their roles has been weakened, then how could you expect that the industrial policy will be designed and implemented in the scientific way? No way. And the last concern of this ambitious plan actually is the fundamental difference between Japan and China, that economic and political system. In Japan and South Korea, I could say in Japan, actually there was no, I call it a deprivation system. There's no such deprivation system, but in China there was. So you could say that both China and Japan, actually they use the fiscal policies, they use financial policies to support their private sector, to lower the costs of their private producers and give them more comparative advantages on the international trade at that stage. And the private sector accumulated a huge bunch of profits. But in China, the government over the past decade, they harvested the profits of the private sector to enrich the upper echelons of the regime. Through what? Through the upstream monopolized industries, like the banking system, like the resource system. All these upstream industries, actually they are state-owned. So they can use them as a tool to harvest the profits of the private sector. It was totally different from Japan. And if there's no reform in the upstream sectors, then I have no confidence, I have to say, if China want to replicate the development state model of Japan and South Korea and put this as the new China model in the next decades. I don't think that will be successful. So the future of China, as I said, if China want to follow the path of a state, it has to control the essential resources and even more tighten the control of the essential resources, not including the finance. Finance was a tool that Japan and South Korea used, but China later, beyond finance, the government will also control the data, because data today is a new productive power, so it can use to help the industrial policy implementation. I don't have much time, so my last word is, China is not Japan. China wants to learn from Japan, learn from South Korea. China is not Japan. If China could tend to be the next Japan and replicate most of the successful factors from what Japan did in the 1950s and 1960s, that would be the most fortunate thing that we will see. Otherwise, China's future will keep to be quite uncertain. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Can we have all the panelists on the stage again, please? Be sitting. So usually, thank you all for these wonderful presentations. So usually, at an event like this, the chair gets to ask the first question. But because I'm a better chair, I will allow the audience to ask all the questions because we only have about half an hour left. So the floor is now open to questions. Please tell us who you are and ask the question.
Brian Tan, senior economist at Barclays. One question I have is, clearly, we've talked about the economic challenges that China's been facing over the last few years. Question that people have is, why hasn't the government come in a much stronger way to rescue the economy? So why is that? Is that because policymakers are unaware of the extent of how bad things have become, and so they haven't been moved into doing it? Is it because they've been pursuing other goals, and so the economy is seen as, unfortunately, something that has to take the brunt of that hit while they pursue other goals? Or is it that they don't have the resources, the fiscal or monetary capacities to do this anymore? Or is that the goal in itself, to bring down the private sector and bring it to its knees?
That one.
I think if I refer to the history, it's not that the government has no necessary resources. If you check China's fiscal space, it's still quite high. Despite of rising fiscal debt, China's debt compared to other countries is relatively low, especially for the central government. Local governments are heavily in debt, but central government is relatively rich. And these huge fiscal stimulus usually come from the central government. And I have been trying to discuss this issue with friends and practitioners like you. Why they act so fast in 2009, and why are they so reluctant to take any actions recently? And most of the answers I got are more political than economic. So economically, as I showed just now, you should act as fast as you can, given the importance of this private sector is driving the growth. But political-wise, you see there's various debate on whether it was right in 2009 to give so much resources to property sectors who ends up driving up the housing bubbles further, and which sort of jeopardize the economic sustainability to many extent. So they feel like they want to punish these sectors who are, doing such a bad thing to Chinese economy in the past. But as you can see, over the past few months, they are doing more and more to rescue this real estate market, starting from the release of these major policy restrictions. In major cities like Beijing and Shanghai, you are now able to purchase with lower down payments and lower mortgage rate. And there's a lot of release in the constraint, but we don't see major funding coming in, maybe because they are afraid of similar things happening again. They sort of waste their efforts. But I think if it buys economy further, or if someone is able to show convincible evidence on the pros and cons, maybe they will roll out this faster. That's what I wish. Thank you.
I'll just quickly chime in there, and I think I agree with Huan's point. But I think because I'm a structuralist, I wanted to, again, present perhaps my thought from the structural point of view. And so the first part would be, the natural question to ask would be, to what extent, because of the centralization of power under President Xi Jinping, to what extent he himself, like or not like the idea of a fiscal stimulus, is in particular in the form of a direct cash deposit to the Chinese household. And if you read the Wall Street Journal, you read Wei Lingling, or you read Greg Ip, their story is that he's ideologically against the idea because this is going to make people become lazy and so on and so forth. I have never talked with President Xi Jinping, I do not know. But I do think there are structural factors that makes it very difficult to make direct household stimulate even work. First is that the measurement of who you are going to give direct deposit to or not. The barriers, the bar is so uneven because of all the various reasons that our co-panelists have talked about. Then the second part is with regard to a lot of the corruptions. We all heard of the local, the so-called Poverty Reduction Bureau, Fuping Ban. A lot of those people can and have been major target of corruption. So even if you are going to give money to household through whom you can do it, and to whom you are going to do it, that is a huge problem. And then the third part goes to a bigger structural problem in terms of household consumption. And again, many people are saying that they don't like to do household consumption, and there are so many different reasons. But I view the system as the entire political economic system, from the banking sector to local government institutions. They are established in the reform, from the early years of reform and open up. They were established to support export growth-led model. The whole idea was to support export growth. And now you are asking the system to do exactly what it is established not to do. So the story of financial repression and a lot of things like that, if you do not change the entire institution, things won't be easily changed. So I'll just stop there. I hope that sort of provide a structural point of view.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really important question. I think I have the following points to make. The first, I fully agree with Huan. I think both in terms of fiscal policy and in terms of monetary policy, and China has a lot of policy space, right? So especially at the central government level. So, but why has it used it, right? So I think my observation are as follows. The first point has to do with ideas. The second point has to do with mechanisms. So in terms of ideas, well, so we have always got the competing school of thoughts, right? So in Chinese policy circles, right? So one is more Keynesian line of thinking. Well, so when we have a major deflationary pressures like this in this kind of environment, probably we should come up with stronger stimulus, right? So not unlike what China did after the 2008 global financial crisis. But that is just one line of thought. And then there's a second line of thought which emphasize moral hazard, emphasize accountability, emphasize fiscal discipline, right? So actually you can see there's a lot of mentioning of this idea of 战略定力, right? This is strategic focus, right? So resilience, meaning that having reviewed the development of various types of financial risks, right? So following 2008 financial crisis, post-2008 financial crisis stimulus package, right? So 4 trillion stimulus package. So China had the increasing accumulation of local government debt. China had growing risks of shadow banking, right? So all of these matters had been reviewed in the years after 2008, right? So after that stimulus package period. So there's an alternative school of thought which show that, which suggests that China now should focus more on structural policy, right? So focus more on addressing the underlying imbalances, right? Promote technological innovation, promote supply chain resilience, increase productivity, instead of just giving out a big stimulus. I think this is a second line of thoughts. And then there's an issue of mechanism, right? So as I mentioned, when we review the mechanism of 2008, post-2008 China stimulus program, yes, central government opened up the policy space, but equally important, if not more important, is the very active role of local governments, right? So in terms of the spending and in investment in all of those big projects, infrastructure projects, etc., and local governments was very proactive in taking on debt, right? So to finance those projects. But now, as I mentioned earlier, so we're in a period of realignment of central-local relations, right? So and now there's an uncertainty about exactly how this relationship should be shaped. And then, well, so there could be the case that the mechanism of delivering that kind of stimulus may not be in place until we have a clearer consensus, right, inside the Chinese policy circles on how to address the local government debt issue and how to reposition the functions of local government in Chinese political economy. Right? So should China continue to have local government serving as an agent of sort of economic growth and operating more or less like a company? Or should Chinese local government serving more like a provider of public goods, social welfare, right? So, and that links up a broader set of discussions.
Okay, so I just want to add a few points. I still believe that the current situation stems in the change in the political structure. So when you make the party to lead everything, actually, if you want to put all the bureaucratic officials under your party's wing, but what you are doing actually is losing the ability to engage those bureaucratic officials in policy making and policy implementation. So for example, a very simple question. If you want to make a policy and implement a policy, but who should be responsible for the outcomes? So we could say that not only the regional officials, regional governments, they start not doing everything, but also at the center level. Many of the policies that should be enacted by the central department, but what we observed over the past years are the central department just use the media to raise 1, 2, 3, 5 to 1,000 proposals, but none of these proposals actually are real landed. So you could say that the phenomenon, as I said, is not only the questions at the center-local relationship, but also in the center government itself. So I believe that the political structural change over the past 10 years is one of the fundamental reasons for your question. And my second point I want to add here is from economic side. I believe that most of the economic difficulties that in China could be attributed to the fleeing away of the manufacturing. So you may see the phenomena, these issues may happen on the household, real estates, or in other aspects of the society. But to remember, manufacturing is the core, is a driving force for China's economy over the past decades. Only you have manufacturing kind of prosperity, then you have people gathered in this region, then you can more easily to push up your price of your house and your commercial real estates. If your manufacturing is fleeing away, actually the trend has been fixed for next 10 to 15 years. You could go to the neighboring countries of Singapore, to Malaysia, to Thailand, to Vietnam, to see how many China's private sector, manufacturing sector, has already moved there or on the way to move there. But this is a dilemma to the Chinese government. On one side, they want to keep this manufacturing in China, but on the other side, they know that if they keep them in China, these manufacturing providers cannot give the central government or local government more tax revenue. So they also want them to move their supply chain to the other countries. Then this is the only way to survive them in the next 10 to 15 years. So this is a dilemma. So due to this kind of economic dilemma, I think the space of policy making for local governments and for central governments has been already restricted. So that is my another point I want to add it here.
Yuxin?
Thank you. Yuxin Ho, I'm an alumnus at the Lee Kuan Yew School. So my question concerns the relationship or the dynamics between the central and the local governments. On the one hand, in terms of fiscal policy, I think Prof. Huan illustrated a very comprehensive picture on the public spending side. And I want to also highlight on the fiscal revenue side of the big picture, which one, most of the majority of provinces in China these days do not generate enough tax revenues for their own public spending and rely on intergovernment transfer payments. And two, according to Bloomberg, if I remember correctly, as of last year, almost 90% of the central government's tax revenues actually goes to intergovernment transfer payments. So one, the provinces do not generate enough revenue to develop themselves. And two, on the other hand, in terms of international policy and development, I think some of the panelists mentioned in the past 20, 30 years, the Chinese economy thrived on competition, both on the corporate level and also on the provincial level. But that also leads to another problem, which is today what China's accused about a lot, which is overcapacity and redundancy of resource investment, right? So therefore, we are seeing a more emphasis on regional and sub-regional rebalancing and coordination in terms of industrial development. So taking that in mind, I wonder, in terms of both fiscal policy and industrial development, how do you envision, what do you suggest the way forward for China to go to get out of this dilemma? Thank you.
I guess I have the first take. A lot of the infrastructures are financed by the local governments. And most of this is to selling of the lands. So when the property market is booming, the land revenue is very handsome. And also it's the how property transactions, it generate a lot of revenues. So this goes to the infrastructure investments. But given the cycle infrastructure investment, you don't just invest it, you have to maintain it. And these cost a lot. And it weighs on the local government's local financing. So how can they get the money to sustain it? A lot of them issue the local government bonds, but this is only happening when the Ministry of Finance allowed them to do so very recently. And even before that, they have to rely on these local government financing vehicles, which is setting up aside something like companies so that they can raise the funds in the name of the infrastructures and give the money for this particular projects. But they becomes no longer sustainable given the increasing inefficiency of these infrastructure products. So this infrastructures was quite efficient in some big cities, right? A huge crowd, but it wasn't efficient in some cities which doesn't have a huge population. So look at the crowd, like infrastructure in Guizhou. Okay, they spend aggressively. Okay, they are not able to finance purely from the land selling. You know, the land price is not that high, so they have to rely on this borrowing. But because of the national pursuit of equality to a certain extent, budgets from the central government is not directly to the rich cities, but to the cities that are relatively poor and needs help. And as I showed you just now, these cities tend to be relatively inefficient in using the money. And you will see that a lot of projects are huge, but they are all wasted. They can't be utilized. Some of them can't even be self-sustained, and it's still crowding in the money that should have gone to private sectors. So this is sort of inefficiency. So it depends on what you are pursuing. If you are pursuing economic efficiency, money should go to those like Shanghai and Jiangsu who are good at spending their money. Now go to the cities, they are not good at turning these investments into profitable projects. And yeah, that's my take.
Just very quickly, I would say yes. I agree with everything Huan just said. But in terms of how to go forward, I had a FA article, foreign affairs article, specifically talking about overcapacity. And there are structural factors leading to overcapacity. But again, if you talk to Chinese policymakers in public setting, they would not say that China has the overcapacity problem, specifically in EV, battery, and the solar cell, or for that matter, artificial intelligence. But it's not that China never had overcapacity problem. They have been talking about or addressing overcapacity publicly since 2005 when Ma Kai, the former director of NDRC, talked about it, right? And over the past decade, they put out a suite of policies trying to address the problem. So how to reconcile this? I think there are perhaps, as far as my limited understanding goes, there are perhaps 3 possible solutions, but none of which would be easy or not costly. The first one could potentially be, and many Chinese economists have also visited Japan, which means they could potentially learn from Japan in the context of voluntary export restriction. So that is perhaps one. It requires a lot of trade negotiation. And then the second one, in particular, in terms of addressing overcapacity problem, it requires a restructure of the central local fiscal capacity. Right now, as a result of the 1994 fiscal reform, you ended up having the mismatch between responsibilities and revenues. Central government basically outsourced responsibilities to local government, whereas they do not really have the fiscal capacity to do so, especially when the tax and revenues from the sale of land use right to the property sector dries up. And then the last part, then the last part probably requires the reform of the WTO multilateral trading system, which is very difficult to do given that the United States, especially if another Trump term is going to be extremely difficult. But a potential, and why this is possible. It is possible because this is something that the European Union is very much interested in to do. In particular, Germany. The idea is instead of designating the entire economy as non-market economy status, how about we negotiate such that we designate sector by sector?
Yeah, I think first of all we need to take into consideration the regional inequality, right? So regional disparity. So as a transfer payment system is very important for China to address these issues. And second, I want to emphasize because Chinese economy now is in the process of deleveraging, right? So deleveraging is not supposed to be painless. It's not supposed to be pretty, right? So it's going to be a painful process, and there are a number of ways to go through this deleveraging, right? So you can have austerity, you can have inflation, you can have growth, right? You can have some sort of redistribution. I think, well, so China has a mix of all of these elements, right? So part of the pain we see in terms of local government or the corporate sector not investing as much as the market expects, right? So it has to do with the broader austerity part of it. And then we probably need to have a more accommodative macro policy and have higher sort of inflation to digest these issues. And we need to keep growth going, right? And then we need to have some redistribution, right? So both at the regional level to address the disparity and also at the market entity level, right? So in terms of tax revenue and expenditure. So I think, but after going through all of this, I remain optimistic about the supply side fundamentals of the Chinese economy, right? So I don't think thinking about nowadays China in terms of 1990s Japan is the best way of looking at it. Yes, demographics, there's a lot, as Zoe put it so nicely, there's a lot of similarity, but in terms of other dimensions, right? So in terms of the per capita GDP, the stage of economic development, in terms of the potential of technological progress, the space of catching up growth, the space of latecomer advantage, I think there's still a lot of potential for the Chinese economy. So now it's $12,000 per capita GDP. I think if Chinese government can get the necessary reforms, a lot of our discussions have covered, and also get the macroeconomic policies right, and then we should be able to see a reasonable good growth, let's say 5 or 6%, and then narrowing the gap of Chinese per capita GDP with more advanced economies.
Okay, regarding the government transfers role that in economic development of China over the 30 years, after 1994 tax reform, intergovernmental transfer played a very important role. But I have to say, today you see the regional disparity of China across different provinces. One of the reasons is intergovernmental transfer, because intergovernmental transfer has two major categories. One is called formula-based general transfer. Yes, this kind of transfer is to shrink the disparity. But another is called the earmark transfer. Earmark transfer actually enlarge the disparity between different regions. And the earmark transfer occupied more than 70% of the total transfer size until the 2002. And starting from 2002, the general transfer, that proportion started to increase gradually, bit by bit. But even today, actually, earmark transfer still occupies a huge proportion of the total government transfer. And regarding to the overcapacity, no matter we talk about infrastructure construction or production capacity, why has China had this kind of overcapacity? There are two reasons. The first reason was the regional competition over the past 30 years. And the second reason is that local governments can only use this kind of basic infrastructure construction, or we say the other kind of construction to provide employment for local people. we could say that a lot of our resourcing projects will emerge after these projects, if these projects was established. But today's China, as I said, I believe that the incentive for local competition has disappeared. And due to the change that between the party system and the state organ system, I could say that local governments start to be more and more cautious in initiating those new infrastructure constructions. So the overcapacity problem, to me, will not be such a big problem that in the future. But the negative side is that the development, the engine of development of China will be also stopped.
So in 2009, during the global financial crisis, Douglas North, Nobel laureate in economics, wrote a book called, with two other colleagues, he wrote a book called Financial Development and Political Institutions. In the concluding chapter, it's probably the last paragraph of the book, he and the co-authors made the argument that political competition and open political markets always go hand in hand with open economic competition and open economic markets. And when you have a mismatch, and they highlighted the case of China, when you have a mismatch, one of them will have to change, inevitably. But how China will change in the future, I think this smart audience must have your own answer. With that, let's thank the panelists for a wonderful set of presentations. And thank you all for coming to this Friday morning session. Thank you all.